Imagine that you have just experienced sexual misconduct or assault on campus. You probably have a million questions about what resources or support are available to you and may seek information from campus officials. You might want to bring legal charges eventually, but you're probably going to be more focused on your own recovery at first. When you seek out these resources, you might find yourself in a situation where the person you just disclosed your situation to is required to make a formal report on your behalf, even without your consent, subjecting you to a process you didn't want and to having your information shared on that report. You just lost control over the situation after you've already experienced the degradation of your autonomy. This is a very real concern for many survivors of sexual assault who disclose that they were assaulted to a mandatory reporter and lose control over the process. Often, choosing whether to press charges isn't a choice left to the victim as it is in many other situations. Even if the survivor only wants access to resources or support, it can be difficult to access those without making a formal report if you aren't aware of the distinction between mandatory reporters and confidential advisors who aren't required to make formal reports. Mandatory reporters are employees who have been designated as responsible employees, with the responsible part entailing a requirement to make formal reports whenever they learn of sexual misconduct on campus, regardless of whether the witness or survivor wants a report to be made. Typically known as universal mandatory reporting, another term for this concept is non-consensual mandatory reporting, as it often goes against the wishes of the survivor. Today, I want to share some insight into why non-consensual mandatory reporting doesn't align with the interests of survivors and does more harm than good in remedying concerns. First, let's talk about the three claims we'll be focusing on in this speech. These claims about universal or non-consensual mandatory reporting include one, that it leads to an increase in support for survivors of sexual assault, two, that it supports employees and makes their role as a community manager and resource easier and more standardized, and three, that there have been a decrease in sexual assault on campuses resulting from a fear from potential perpetrators about consequences. But before we jump into the arguments for why these claims are meritless, I'll briefly describe what these reporting policies are and what they entail. Universal mandatory reporting policies are those adopted by universities in response to Title IX regulations and requirements regarding the disclosure and reporting of sexual harassment, misconduct, and assault on campuses. Title IX and other relevant statutes say that responsible employees are required to make formal reports whenever they learn about an instance of sexual violence on campus. These policies then adopt a wide net strategy in determining who responsible employees are, and typically they include anyone who is not a designated confidential advisor, such as someone covered by HIPAA laws, on that list. This can make it difficult for survivors seeking resources to know whether the person they're talking to is going to be required to make a report or not. Now, let's talk about the first claim, that universal mandatory reporting provides support for survivors of sexual assault. It's important for us to be aware that mandatory reporting laws were initially enacted to protect children or older individuals or those with mental disorders who may be unable to advocate for themselves. We can probably all agree that college students typically aren't children, aren't the elderly, and typically don't have a mental disorder that prevents them from advocating for themselves. It's also important to realize that non-consensual mandatory reporting further erodes the autonomy and consent of the survivor when they need it most, following an event where they had no autonomy. This can make survivors scared to reach out to anyone if they don't want to make a formal report, or can subject them to a process they didn't want to be a part of to begin with. A study by Catherine Holland, an expert in the field of sexual violence research, published a study in 2021 showing that when presented with three options for policies governing reporting requirements by responsible employees, as many as 78% of sexual assault survivors believed that non-consensual mandatory reporting was the worst option, and 95% believed that student-directed reporting was the best option. Student-directed reporting means that responsible employees are still required to make formal reports, but only with the consent of the witness or survivor. Additionally, many survivors decide not to seek resources or support because most employees they reach out to will be required to make a report, and that those reports are almost always requiring non-anonymous information to be recorded, such as the survivor's name. For a policy that's intended to have survivors' best interests at heart, more than 3/4 of survivors disapproving of the policy shows that it simply isn't working. And these policies aren't just confounding the situation for survivors, they're making it harder for employees to perform their duties as well. The next claim is that these policies support employees in their roles and standardize their duties, as well as eases the training for their position. Unfortunately, it seems the policies do as much to harm the reputation of employees and their relationships with students as any benefit they provide. Another study conducted by Holland in 2019 investigated resident assistants' perceptions of non-consensual mandatory reporting and found that, on average, most did not believe that these policies helped them to gain the trust of their students, and more than a tenth of them believed that these policies actively damaged their ability to build that trust. Additionally, the participants indicated that these policies made it more difficult to foster their community and establish themselves as an approachable authority. Furthermore, wide net policies and assigning responsible employees can make employees' roles more difficult and less appealing to candidates. Not only do they need more training, but they also must navigate the duties of their role on a foundation that does not support their role as a community leader. Many employees also struggle with the requirement to make formal reports against the wishes of a survivor and face a moral dilemma, as it further erodes any relationship that they have built with the students. This is especially true in the case of professors who must tread the thin line between serving as a resource to students and potentially crumbling the relationship that they've built with them. So no, universal mandatory reporting policies don't support employees in establishing and maintaining their community. And much like this claim wasn't supported by evidence, the final claim that these policies have effectively decreased assault over time also isn't true. Statistics provided by the Department of Education in 2021 and the Association of American Universities Campus Climate Survey in 2019 show that there hasn't been a significant change in the number of sexual crimes on campuses between 2015 and 2021. Additionally, according to the data, the number of rapes committed in that span has actually increased by almost 10%, and the counts of fondling have increased by almost 50%. So despite claims that these policies are reducing the number of crimes committed, we're actually seeing an increase in certain crimes. So what does this all mean? Well, simply put, non-consensual mandatory reporting isn't having the intended effect. More crimes are being committed on campuses, more survivors are avoiding seeking resources to keep their autonomy intact, and the role of employees in establishing trust and maintaining their community has been weakened, all resulting from non-consensual mandatory reporting. The good news is that these findings represent relatively recent research in the field, and more is being done every day to demonstrate the importance of well-designed policies that have survivors' interests at heart. Now, as we get to the end of our time together, let's look at the takeaways. First, we refuted the claim that non-consensual reporting policies support survivors by discussing how they invalidate the autonomy of survivors and lead to some survivors not seeking support. Then we showed how these policies erode the trust and relationship that employees have with their students. And finally, we showed that these policies have been ineffective at reducing the number of sexual crimes on campuses. We've covered a lot of ground in showing why these policies don't work, and it should now be clear that non-consensual mandatory policies simply aren't the right choice, and we should be moving forward from these obsolete practices. So I urge each of you to share in saying out with the old and in with the new. It's time to start putting survivors first. Thank you.